Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back to a warm and quiet Mediterranean sea, somewhere between Naxos and the open horizon, where a lonely ship bobs on still water. The wood creaks softly under a windless sky. You can almost smell the salted air and hear nothing but gulls until a stranger boards the vessel, barefoot and smiling. You see, tonight's story isn't about thunderbolts or wars. It's about wine, mischief, and revenge, a very slowed revenge. And the god of that revenge, Dionysus, who preferred vineyards over battlefields and music over politics. But when slighted, even he had a way of making people regret it. In this case, by turning a ship full of cocky pirates into sleek, confused dolphins. And the real question, you'll wonder, why did he wait so long to do it? You probably won't survive this journey, not because it's dangerous, but because it's so delightfully slow, you'll forget you ever had worries in the first place. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments, what's your location and local time right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's early morning in the Aegean, the sea still wearing its night blue. The ship's deck is quiet, sailors still yawning, sails trimmed, salt stinging dry lips. The man they just picked up stands barefoot near the prow. Odd fellow, not a coin to his name, no bag or tools, just a gentle grin, and a garland of ivy draped over his messy curls. He looks far too relaxed to be adrift, far too pleased. But the captain pays him no mind. They're used to strange travelers. This one just asked for a ride to Naxos. Easy, the island's on their way. Maybe he'll pay in fish or wine, except he hasn't spoken since boarding. Now, here's what makes this part of the myth so quietly unsettling. The ship's crew wasn't evil, not murderers, not even tyrants, just ordinary men making an ordinary living. But that's the thing with Greek gods. They don't punish you for being wicked. They punish you for being foolish. And mocking a god, that's foolish. The man sits cross-legged at the bow. The sailors chuckle behind his back. Drunk already, one says. Must have fallen off a party boat. Another laughs. The captain says nothing, just steers toward Naxos, occasionally glancing at their mysterious passenger. They don't know it yet, but that man is And Dionysus, when he takes human form, always watches first. He listens. He gives people enough rope to hang themselves with. Even now, the sea is unnaturally calm. The sun is too bright. A faint humming, maybe flute music, floats just outside hearing. But the sailors don't notice. They've seen the ocean 1,000 times. They've loaded crates. What's another quiet ride? And that's exactly what Dionysus waits for. Now, let's pull back a moment from the ship itself and into the story behind the story. The myth comes from a very old Homeric hymn, those pre-Homeric oral poems whispered in symposia after too much mead. The kind of tale passed around under olive trees when night fell early and wine tasted better than water. And this one stuck because it was small, boring, even. No kingdoms fall, no giants fight, just a ship, a god, and some poor fools who didn't know better. But myths like these survive because they sneak up on us, because they're not about monsters, but about misjudging the divine, about being too confident in your understanding of the world. So let's go back aboard. By now, the sailors have made their decision. They whisper to one another in the galley. Maybe they'll sell this stranger as a slave. Surely someone in Asia Minor would pay for a strong-backed man, even if he is odd. Maybe he's a minor noble, or just lucky with his teeth. They're thinking of coin, of the taverns they'll visit, of the girls they'll impress. But Dionysus still sits calm as ever, his eyes closed. He's humming now, not loud, but rhythmic, gentle, a lullaby, almost. Then vines begin to grow. They're first noticed by the helmsman, who sees a green shoot curling out from the mast. At first, he blinks it away, but another vine slips down the rigging. Ivy, thick and twisting, growing impossibly fast. Leaves unfurl. Grapes burst open. The helmsman drops the wheel and stares. Wine drips from the sail. The sailors scramble, panic slowly blooming across their faces. The ship groans like it's breathing. The air turns sweet, overripe, intoxicating. And Dionysus opens his eyes. He doesn't speak, just stands, very slowly. His feet make no sound on the planks. Now, the sailors try to leap overboard, but their bodies don't obey. Instead, their legs bend, their skin shifts. They feel bones soften, stretch, their mouths seal shut, their arms flatten into fin. The last thing they see before diving headfirst into the sea is the god watching them amused. Moments later, a pod of dolphins dances around the boat, but Dionysus doesn't laugh. He just sighs. Because here's the part the old hymns never quite explain. Why dolphin? Why not birds? Or frogs? Or just death? That's the question. And more importantly, why did he let them board in the first place? Why let them plan his capture, plot his sail, mock his presence, and then punish them only when escape seemed near? What lesson does that teach? Maybe it's mercy? Maybe it's transformation? Maybe dolphins, with their laughter and leaping, are a more eternal kind of shame. Or maybe, just maybe, he liked them. The sea, now thick with sun and myth, rolls softly beneath Dionysus' feet. He stands alone on the deck, surrounded by silence. The ship is still, the vines still cling to the mast, ripe with heavy grapes. The air remains soaked in sweetness, almost cloying, and the dolphins, those strange new forms of what once were men, circled the vessel with unsettling familiarity. You watch them leap, spin, play. But is it joy, or is it madness? Dionysus doesn't explain. He never does. Instead, he lowers himself to sit once more at the bow, not out of exhaustion, but because he's finished. Not with the sea, but with a lesson. This quiet aftermath is what myths often leave out. Not the transformation, but a moment after, when a god returns to stillness and watches the world settle around the chaos he brought. It's here, in the silence, that we begin to understand Dionysus not as the god of wine or party, but as the patron of change itself. Let's pull back for a moment, because to understand what just happened on this ship, you need to know who Dionysus really was. He is not like the other gods, born of a mortal mother, Semele, and the king of gods, Zeus. Dionysus lived between worlds. He did not belong on Olympus, not truly. The others mocked him. His rituals were wild. His followers danced with snakes and wore ivy crowns, drank until speech melted into chant. His worship was not structured, not clean. It was emotional, animal, feminine. He wandered far and wide, across Asia Minor, across Thrace, through the vineyards and mountains, gathering women minted into his cult. They danced until they collapsed. They sang until words dissolved into sound. And yet through it all, he was also gentle. A god of letting go, of yielding, of madness, yes, but also of release. And that's what makes this myth, the Dolphin one, so odd. Because here, Dionysus isn't inviting joy. He's enforcing respect. Quietly, methodically, he gives these pirates every chance to do the right thing, to act with kindness. And when they don't, he doesn't destroy them. He changes them, not into stone, not into ash, but into dolphins creatures beloved by Greeks, playful, intelligent, almost human, but forever unable to explain themselves. Back aboard, the god finally raises a hand. The vines shrink, the wine-soaked sails dry. Almost miraculously, the ship rights itself. No more humming, no more illusions. Just one man, one boat, and a ring of dolphins. And here's a strange historical wrinkle. Ancient sailors believed dolphins were once human. The Greeks loved them, yes, but they also feared them. Stories whispered that dolphins rescued drowning poets, but only the poets. Ordinary men were sometimes dragged down, sometimes bitten. There was always something eerie in their intelligence, something mournful in the way they watched passing ships. That's what makes this myth feel real, not because of its magic, but because of the emotion that lingers. Regret, wonder, punishment, without cruelty. Let's talk about the source. The Homeric hymn to Dionysus. It's short, less than 2 pages, but it lingers. And unlike many other hymns, it doesn't ask for favor. It doesn't offer praise. It simply tells this story, this strange, slow revenge. And from this small story, artists carved amphorae, poets built metaphors, and philosophers debated justice. Now, let's look at it from another angle. What if Dionysus wasn't just testing them? What if this was always the plan? He didn't need a ride. He could have appeared on Naxos in a blink. He could have conjured his own ship from sea foam or mist. But instead, he chose to drift. Alone. Vulnerable. Watching. Maybe this wasn't punishment. Maybe it was mercy disguised as consequence. Remember, in ancient Greek religion, punishment wasn't always about justice. Sometimes, it was transformation meant to guide. Just like Arachne became a spider. Not out of hatred, but so she could continue weaving. Just like Daphne became a laurel tree not because she was bad, but because she refused to yield to Apollo. In that sense, dolphins weren't a curse, they were a continuation. The pirates became something else, but something still living, still breathing, still watching ships sail by. You have to wonder, did they remember? Did they watch the horizon for other gods, hoping to redeem themselves? Or did they simply forget? That's the part the myth doesn't say. It leaves us with silence, and with the god seated alone on a boat, floating toward Naxos. Now, about Naxos, it's not just a dot on a map. In Dionysus stories, Naxos is everything. It's the island where he found Ariadne, abandoned by Theseus, the place where he comforted her, made her his wife, and crowned her in stars. In other words, Naxos is the island of healing, which makes you wonder, did Dionysus float there alone now because he needed comfort? Was this whole episode not about justice, but grief? Did he punish the pirates because they reminded him too much of Theseus? Cruel, loud, careless with strangers. That's the real heart of this myth. It isn't about power. It's about sadness. Slow, creeping sadness, the kind that finds you even when you're divine. And dolphins, they're fitting symbols for that. Always smiling, always leaping, but always swimming away. As the ship nears Naxos, Dionysus finally lies back. He gazes at the sky. No more vines, no more humming, just wind now, and the creak of wood. The dolphins trail behind him, not as captives, but as witnesses. It's almost quiet again. Almost. And maybe that's the most human thing of all, to leave behind your mistakes, not in anger, but in movement, in a different shape, a different skin. And yet, if the dolphins are still circling, even now, what are they waiting for? A second chance, or someone new to test? The ship finally drifts into view of Naxos, the rugged outline of the island breaking the horizon like a sleeping lion. White cliffs catch the late afternoon sun, and olive trees ripple in the breeze. A few goats perch impossibly on rocks, as if they were always meant to watch the sea. The dolphins, those strange, sinuous echoes of men, follow no further. As the coast grows near, they vanish beneath the waves, leaving only the memory of foam behind. No splash, no farewell, just silence. Dionysus does not look back. He knows what they've become, but he also knows something else. They were never going to make it to Naxos. Not as men, not as pirates, not as merchants of betrayal. They had to become something new, because Naxos, unlike any other island, is not a place for punishment. It's a place for rebirth. Let's linger on that. The Greeks believed in fate. Yes, but also in change. In that strange middle space between destiny and free will, where gods meddle and mortals are shaped. Dionysus is not a god of destruction. He's the god of passage. He takes you from one state to another, sober to drunk, grief to release, flesh to furore. In this case, Finns and the pirates, they were not destroyed. They were transitioned like caterpillars into butterflies, or soldiers into ghosts. No longer what they were, but still haunting the surface. That's why this myth endures, because it doesn't end with fire or death. It ends with transformation, with a second life, albeit one no longer human. Now, Dionysus steps off the ship and into the sand. No fanfare, no music, just his own shadow falling across the shore, his bare feet pressed down on soft earth. The sky is streaked with honey and smoke, and there, among the rocks and wild thyme, sits Ariadne. This is the part many retellings forget to mention, that the dolphin myth ends in reunion. You see, this isn't just a story about punishment. It's a story that pivots, quietly, into love. Ariadne had been left here once, betrayed by Theseus, after helping him escape the labyrinth. She had held the thread that saved him, the knowledge that guided him, and he, in return, abandoned her as she slept. But Dionysus does not abandon. He arrived. He sits beside her. He gives her a crown of stars, and makes her a goddess, not because she earned it, but because she survived. Just like the pirates were not condemned for malice, but for carelessness, Ariadne is not rewarded for greatness. She is loved for her pain. And that subtle thread of feeling is what ties this myth together. Dionysus is the god of duality, of masks and truth, of chaos and serenity. He teaches by experience, not edict. His punishments feel like dreams, his love like madness. You never quite know if you've been blessed or cursed until it's over. Let's return, for a moment, to the dolphins. They still exist, after all. Some say they travel in pairs. surfacing near ships and watching with oddly human eyes. Others claim that if you whisper a hymn to Dionysus on a moonless night, one will follow your boat for hours. But what if that's not superstition? What if some part of them remembers? And what if that's the point? To spend the rest of your existence swimming beneath the surface of a world you used to walk? To be joy incarnate, and yet always just outside the boat. It's not hard to see why the Greeks held a reverent unease for dolphins. There were symbols of rescue, but also of warning. Friendly, yes, but uncanny. They are creatures of transformation, of crossing thresholds, just like Dionysus. So what's the real lesson here? It's not, don't anger the gods. That's too simple. It's watch carefully when things are quiet. When the ship is calm, when the traveler smiles to ease, when the vines creep too slowly. Because change rarely arrives with thunder. It often begins with ivy growing where it shouldn't, and it ends with a new shape entirely. For the pirates, it meant a new life in the sea. For Ariadne, it meant resurrection on land. And for Diana, it meant a kind of peace. Not the peace of stillness, but the peace of release, of letting go, of becoming. That's why this myth quiet. It reminds us that transformation doesn't always feel like a miracle. Sometimes it feels like a punishment, like a detour, like being turned into something you didn't choose. But with time, it becomes your nature. And maybe that's what the dolphins show us. Leaping into spray, there's still beauty, even in what we become by accident, even when we forget who we were, even when we're just watching ships go by. It's a quiet dawn on Mount Selene. The peaks are still hidden in haze, and the air smells like sheep's wool and wet stone. Somewhere in a cave tucked into the side of the hill, a baby is giggling. Not just any baby, Hermes, only hours old, is already planning his first theft. You've likely heard of Hermes as the messenger god-winged sandals, fleet-footed errands, maybe a scroll tucked under his arm. But that version comes later. The Hermes of today's story is newborn, and already up to no good. Because this is the day he steals 50 sacred cattle from Apollo, the day he invents a musical instrument using a tortoise shell, and the day he talks his way out of trouble with a smile so wide that even his angry brother forgets what he was mad about. This isn't a myth about triumph. It's not about war or fate or tragedy. It's about cleverness, that subtle Greek virtue so often valued more than strength. It's a myth where the god of language learns how to lie and how to charm, and where music sweet, unexpected music is born out of mischief. Let's begin with the birth. Hermes is born at dawn. His mother, Maia, is one of the Pleiades daughters of Atlas, and herself a shadowy figure who avoids Olympus. She gives birth in a cave, far from the noise of divine politics. No celebration, no prophecy, just a boy wrapped in swaddling cloth. And that boy, minutes old, is already restless. By noon, he's slipped out of the cradle. By sunset, he's invented sandals, walked across Greece, stolen cattle, and crafted an entirely new musical instrument. How? Because Hermes is the god of movement, and movement doesn't wait. Now, let's pause here to consider something fascinating. This myth appears in the Homeric hymn to Hermes, a poem that is part praise, part comedy. It's one of the earliest known stories of Hermes and reads almost like a farce, but the humor is gentle, never mocking. Hermes is clever, but not cruel, mischievous, but not malicious. The hymn suggests a culture fascinated by speed, not just physical speed, but speed of thought. The kind of wit that turns lies into art, and mistakes into mythology. So Hermes, now crawling through the forest, stumbles upon a tortoise. And instead of ignoring it or fearing it, he picks it up, laughs, and says, "Ah, an omen of luck." Within minutes, he has hollowed out its shell, strung 7 sheepgut strings across it, and plucked the first lyre into existence. It sings warm and metallic, oddly tender. Imagine that. Music, not as a gift from the heavens, but as the byproduct of a prank. A musical instrument invented not by a poet or a lover, but by a thief. That's the essence of Hermes. After this small triumph, he moves on to the main act. Stealing the sacred cattle of Apollo, he walks backward to hide his tracks. He ties brooms to the cows' tails to obscure their prints. He leads them across rocky terrain where footprints won't stick. And when he gets to a secret meadow, he hides them carefully. All of this by a baby no older than half a day. Meanwhile, Apollo Songog, archer-musician, awakens to find his prized cattle missing. He is not amused. And here's where the myth turns from comedy to courtroom drama. Apollo storms down Mount Olympus, golden with rage. He finds Hermes, back in his cradle, cooing innocently. He accuses the infant of theft. Hermes, still technically not even 1 day old, looks up and says something like, "Me? A newborn? I haven't even left the cave." Apollo is furious. The child is lying, obviously, but he lies so well, so sweetly. He even throws in some poetry for good measure. The gods gather. A trial of sorts ensues. And Zeus, father of both, because Hermes isn't just lying. He's testing language, learning its boundaries, discovering how words can be shaped, bent, softened. He is the god of communication in its rawest form. Not yet scrolls and treaties, but tricks and tongue twists, half-truths, promises that sound like jokes. Eventually, Apollo demands restitution, and Hermes, now reaching under his cloak, offers him the lyre. He plucks a few notes. The air quiets. Even the gods lean in. The music is so pure, so haunting, so unlike anything the world has ever heard, that Apollo forgets the cattle. He takes the lyre instead. Hermes has just bartered stolen property for eternal forgiveness. An Apollo, god of music, of light, of prophecy, because even he can't argue with something that beautiful. Now, Hermes doesn't stop here. He continues on, becoming the messenger of the gods, the guide of souls, the patron of thieves, merchants, travelers, even shepherds. But in this myth, his very first day, he earns all of that simply by being clever, by making something new, by seeing potential where others saw problems. And that's what makes this story so quietly powerful. It's not about conquest. It's about creativity. Not about justice, but about charm. It reminds us that intelligence isn't just about knowledge, it's about play. About asking, what if, even when you shouldn't, and lying. Well, sometimes it's the first form of storytelling. But here's what remains unanswered. Did Hermes plan to give the lyre away all along? Was the theft merely a means to create art? Or did he, in that moment, invent the idea of exchange, trickery for beauty, mischief for music? That's the question that lingers in this myth. The gods have a strange way of parenting. When Zeus watches his infant son lie to Apollo's face and invent an instrument to charm the angry god into forgiveness, he doesn't scold him. He laughs, because Hermes, in that single day, proves he belongs on Olympus, or piety, but through pure, unfiltered brilliance. So let's pause for a moment and step back into that divine trial room. Picture the marble floors of Olympus, polished smooth by centuries of divine footsteps. The great columns rise like ancient trees. The air tastes like lightning. And in the center of it all, a newborn lies in his swaddle, smug and blinking, surrounded by immortals who have lived for thousands of years and have never seen this before. Apollo, for all his strength and radiant fury, is flustered. He points. He paces. He demands justice. Hermes, eyes wide and voice syrupy sweet, replies, "I'm just a little one. How could I know what cows are, or what walking is, or what theft even means? It's absurd, and somehow completely believable." Now, Hermes isn't just lying to get away with it. He's testing the gods, testing the limits of logic and persuasion. And what's even more interesting, the gods let him. They could have struck him down, cast him out, declared the lyre a stolen artifact and Hermes an outcast. But instead they watch, they listen, because what Hermes represents is something new, something disruptive, and the Greek gods, for all their ego and wrath, are deeply interested in novelty. Let's revisit the cattle for a moment. Hermes doesn't just hide them, he leads them backward, creates misleading hoof tracks, and even invents fire to cook two of them, offering the meat as a secret sacrifice to himself. Yes, he invents fire. In past, that's the kind of day this is. And when Hermes does all this, he also sets up a template for the future. Invention through necessity, creativity born out of deception. He doesn't steal just to possess. He steals to create, to build. That's a very different kind of myth. Most Greek stories involve punishment, think Prometheus stealing fire and being chained to a rock. But Hermes, he steals and is rewarded, because his theft adds to the world. He invents fire, sandals, musical instruments, and even primitive barter, offering something beautiful in exchange for something broken. That brings us back to the lyre. When Hermes offers it to Apollo, he does it not as an apology, but as a trade. He knows Apollo is a musician. He's heard the songs, and he knows deep down that this object, this string tortoise shell, will speak louder than any excuse. So he plays it. 7 strings, a sound like wind over reeds, like rain falling on olive leaves, a melody that softens the edges of divine fury. Apollo stops, he listens, and he smiles. In that moment, something shifts between them. Not just a truce, but a bond. The hot-tempered sun god and the cool, clever trickster. They are opposites, but suddenly complementary. Apollo says, "Give me this lyre." Hermes replies, "Take it," and thus, the god of light becomes the god of music. Just like that, no blood, no war, no fire, just an instrument changing hands, and with it, the balance of mythology. Now, here's the quiet genius of Hermes. He not only invents the lyre, he doesn't hoard it. He doesn't claim divine ownership. He trades it. He understands that power isn't about what you keep. It's about what you create and what you share. Even as a baby, Hermes has grasped something most gods never learn. Influence is greater than control. By giving Apollo the lyre, Hermes doesn't lose power. He gains it through favor, through narrative, through legacy, because Apollo now owes him something, a kind of eternal debt. And Hermes, he'll never let him forget it. Let's not forget how Hermes spins the whole ordeal. By the end of the hymn, he's not just forgiven, he's officially welcomed into the Olympian order. Zeus appoints him messenger of the gods. Apollo gives him the caduceus, a symbol of diplomacy, trade, and communication. And Hermes, he smiles, because the whole thing went exactly as he intended. This moment marks the beginning of Hermes' ascent not through violence or divine birthright, but through ingenuity. He becomes the god of transitions, of doorways, of everything in between. He exists in motion, never still, never settled, always halfway between shadow and light. That's why Hermes is such a powerful mythological figure, not because he's grand, but because he's small, quick, clever. He belongs to the spaces no other god wanted to rule. The road, the boundary, the breath between sentences. And from this tiny, almost comical story, we get a deity that governs commerce, messaging, language, negotiation, invention, travel, and even thievery, all because, in his first day of life, he chose to lie creatively. But here's the question. Was Hermes already destined to become all this? Or did he shape his own divine portfolio by playing the game better than anyone else? Did Zeus see something in him? Or did Hermes plant something in Zeus? That quiet, flickering doubt is what makes this story linger. By the end of that very first day, Hermes has done more than most gods do in a century. He's lied convincingly to Apollo. He's stolen sacred property and gotten away with it. He's invented music, and he's negotiated his place among the Olympians not by force, not by flattery, but by wit. It's easy to think of this myth as light, and it is on the surface. But beneath the playful tone lies something deeper, something that speaks to the way Greek culture valued cleverness, especially in the form of metis, a kind of cunning intelligence. Hermes embodies metis from the moment he takes his first breath. He isn't a god of brute force or lofty prophecy. He is a god who understands the spaces between things, between truth and lie, gift and theft, music and silence. And now, with the lyre passed to Apollo and his own place among the gods secured, Hermes begins the next part of his journey not as a child, but as a figure with purpose. He returns to his mother, Maia, and tells her everything. Imagine that conversation. She, a quiet goddess who lives in a cave to avoid listening to her infant son explain how he stole from the sun god, tricked the divine court, and came home with a job offer from Zeus. There's no anger, no punishment, just wonder, because Maia knows, even then, that her son is going to change the world not through war. Let's return to the lyre, briefly. Apollo, the new owner, makes it famous. He becomes the god of music, of harmony and rhythm. But the invention remains Hermes. The idea, the first pluck of string, the recognition that even a hollow tortoise shell could be turned into something transcendent. This becomes a theme in Hermes' myths, using what's available. No thunderbolts, no chariots of fire, just whatever happens to be nearby. A shell, a broom. That's why he becomes the patron of travelers, not just because he moves, but because he adapts. He finds paths where none seem to exist. Now, in the older Greek imagination, this story did more than amuse. It explained the origin of music. Yes, but it also served as a kind of cultural reassurance. It told them that the gods weren't all rigid and terrifying, that among the thrones of lightning and sea storms and bloodied spears, there was one god who would bend the rules, one who'd laugh, one who'd protect you not because you were righteous, but because you were clever. Hermes becomes the god you pray to when crossing borders, signing contracts, or smoothing over lies. He isn't fair, always, but he's fair enough if you know how to speak his language. And that language, It's not grammar, it's not poetry, it's persuasion. Let's consider one of the strangest after effects of this myth. Hermes later becomes the guide of souls into the underworld. Not Hades, not Charon Hermes. Why? Because even in death, there are transitions, passages, conversations. And who better to guide you across the final threshold than the god who knows every road, every shortcut, every story? He becomes the invisible escort between this life and the next. Quiet, swift, merciful, and you, like Apollo, don't even realize what's happened until it's over. That's the beauty of this myth. It begins with a joker, baby stealing cow's hand, ends with the construction of a divine archetype, the patron of movement, of exchange, of invention, all from a single, stolen day. And Hermes himself, he never stops moving. Throughout Greek myth, he appears again and again, not at the center of epic battles, but on the sidelines, whispering, delivering, tipping the scales, gently, helping Odysseus avoid Circe's spell, handing Perseus the tools to slay Medusa, telling Priam how to sneak into Achilles' tent to beg for Hector's body. He's always there, not obvious, but always on time. That's Hermes, never staying long, but always knowing where to go next. So what should we take from this oddly gentle myth? That music can come from a shell, that lies can sometimes lead to beauty, that even the gods admire a well-told story, and that cleverness, used with care, can open more doors than strength ever could. But perhaps the most mysterious question remains. Did Hermes truly need to steal those cattle? Or did he just want to see if he could? Was the lyre a gift of apology? Or a test? And if you met Hermes on the road tonight, would you recognize him? Or would he have already walked past, smiling, leaving only a faint trace of music in the wind? It's a slow morning on Mount Olympus. The gods are assembling in the great hall again. Ambrosia is being passed around. Hera is sharpening a look of disapproval. Ares is flexing for no one. Apollo is plucking at his lyre. And Dionysus is already half asleep with a cup of wine in hand. And Hestia, she's not there. In fact, she rarely is. Because today's story is about the one goddess who quietly stepped away from power, who gave up her throne not out of weakness or fear, but because she simply didn't want to be part of the noise anymore. This is the tale of Hestia, goddess of the hearth, the firstborn of Cronus and Rhea, the sister of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, a goddess so old that she predates most temples, yet so forgotten that few stories even mention her name. And yet, if you'd lived in ancient Greece, her presence would have been the first you greeted at dawn, and the last you honored at dusk. Hestia wasn't just a background figure. She was the home. Let's begin at the beginning. When the Olympian gods rose to power after the Titan Amachi, Zeus claimed the skies, Poseidon, the seas, Hades, the underworld. Hera ruled marriage and childbirth. Demeter, the harvest. Hestia, she asked for the hearth, a quiet, flickering flame at the center of every home. Not a battlefield, not a realm, just the space where bread was baked, where children were warmed, where prayers were whispered at the end of the day. It doesn't sound like much. No lightning, no dolphins, no drama. But in practice, it made her the most present of all the gods. Because every fire that cooked a meal was her altar. Every family that ate together unknowingly invoked her name. And every city-state in Greece maintained a public hearth, kept eternally lit in her honor. She was everywhere by being nowhere in particular. Now, Olympus had 12 thrones, and at some point nobody agrees exactly when there was a problem. Dionysus, the new god of wine, theater, and ecstatic mystery, wanted a seat. But the council was full. 12 gods, 12 thrones, no room for more. Arguments started. Poseidon grumbled. Ares scoffed. Apollo argued. Hera raised her eyebrows to dangerous heights. And Hestia she stood, and offered her seat. No thunder, no ultimatum, just a quiet withdrawal. She stepped away so that Olympus could have peace, and she never returned. Let that sink in. A goddess gave up her place in the pantheon not because she was defeated, or cast out, or forgotten, but because she chose serenity over status. This, in a mythology filled with jealousies, grudges, and endless squabbles, is almost shocking. In fact, it's nearly boring. But that's the point. Hestia's power was boredom, quiet, stability. She is the opposite of dramatic. And yet, the ancient Greeks revered her more universally than almost any other deity. Every sacrifice began with an offering to Hestia, and every prayer ended with her name. before Zeus, before Hera, before anyone you thanked Hestia. Because what is divine, if not the comfort of a warm fire and a safe roof? Let's look at her symbols. Flame, circle, home. Nothing sharp, nothing violent. She had no weapon, no myths of conquest, no scandals. Her stories are nearly invisible, but her presence is constant. There's something deeply subversive about that. In a pantheon of chaos, she is order. In a family of shouting gods, she is the one who listens. Now, there's an old philosophical question hidden in a myth. Is renouncing power the greatest form of power? The Greeks respected cunning and strength. Yes, but they also revered moderation, and Hestia embodied it perfectly. She didn't need a throne to be worshipped. Her altar was in every home. Her temple was the entire city. She never left Olympus in shame. She elevated it by stepping back. Which brings us to a fascinating point. She may have vanished from the stories, but she never vanished from the world. Because the hearth was sacred. Every fire in every home was tended as if it were divine. When cities were founded, a flame from the mother city's hearth was carried to the new colony to preserve the spirit of Hestia. That's identity. So while Zeus threw lightning and Athena advised kings, Hestia held the culture together. She didn't need drama. She was the reason anyone had time for it in the first place. But here's a mystery. Why don't we talk about her more? Why do stories fade when a character refuses to fight? Why is silence mistaken for weakness? That's the question. The flames of Olympus never go out. At least, not the ones tended in Hestia's name. Long after she stepped down from her seat among the 12, her fire continued to burn steadily at the center of every home, every temple, and every polis across Greece. It was never loud, never central to great myths of war or lust or betrayal. And yet, somehow, it was always there. The center of everything was Hestia. Not because she demanded it, but because people needed it. Let's walk, slowly, into an ancient Greek home. Nothing grand, just a small courtyard house in Athens, around 450 BCE. The floor is swept. The walls are whitewashed with faded ochre. In the middle, a round hearth. The fire is low, the smell of smoke gently clinging to the beams above. Bread bakes on a clay dish. Children play nearby. An old woman stirs something fragrant. No one says this is Hestia's altar, but it is. No statue, no gold, just the flame, quietly alive. That is how Hestia lived in the world. Without drama, without mythic interference, just a presence so constant. People stopped noticing it, like the pulse in your wrist or the air in your lungs. But beneath that, silence is a profound kind of sacrifice. By giving up her throne, Hestia gave something rare in Greek myth. An example of restraint. The Greeks wrote about hubris constantly, about prideful mortals overstepping bounds, about gods punishing excess. But they rarely honored characters for choosing less. Hestia is the exception. When she gave up her place among the 12 to Dionysus, she didn't disappear. She expanded. Because now, she didn't just belong to Olympus. She belonged everywhere. Temples to Hestia were circular, open at the top, so smoke could drift into the sky. They contained a single flame. And unlike other temples, they weren't places for spectacle. No oracles, no battles, just stillness. A place to sit, to breathe, to begin. And that's the point. Hestia came first in everything. Every sacrifice began with her name. Even Zeus, king of the gods, required Hestia's blessing before his rites could begin. That's not just ceremonial. It's spiritual infrastructure. The idea that peace must precede power, that warmth must precede worship. Now let's consider something stranger. In Roman mythology, Hestia becomes Vesta, and Vesta's cult is huge. The Vestal Virgins, her priestesses, guarded the sacred flame in the Forum of Rome, a fire that symbolized the health of the empire itself. If it went out, it was considered an omen of disaster. The virgins were bound to their duties for 30 years. They lived in seclusion, carried immense social honor, and if they broke their vows, were buried alive. It's dramatic. It's severe. And yet, it's still rooted in Hestia's quiet idea that the fire must be kept burning at all costs. Even Rome, loud, sprawling, militaristic Rome, understood the power of a goddess who didn't fight. That's the paradox. The most stable things don't shout. They just endure. Think about how often flame appears in stories not as destruction, but as continuity, a signal. In Greek homes, when a daughter married and moved into her husband's household, a coal from her family's hearth was carried with her, a literal transfer of Hestia from one home to another. No speeches, Just fire. And fire, like Hestia, needs very little to survive. Just air. Just patience. Just someone willing to tend it. So while the gods of Olympus battled monsters and seduced mortals, Hestia remained where she was needed, at the center of the home, at the center of the city, at the center of belonging. And it's here we should talk about something even subtler: why the Greeks trusted her. She had no myths of punishment, no stories of jealousy, no divina vendettas. She simply was. In a world of chaos, she was order. In a religion built on fear and appeasement, she was comfort. Her name means hearth, but also foundation, the first stone in a home, the first breath in a prayer. She is not remembered for what she did, but for what she maintained. That's not usually how gods are honored, but maybe it should be. And so we're left with a question, one the Greeks themselves may never have resolved. Was Hestia forgotten because she never fought? Or was she remembered more deeply because she never needed to? So much of mythology is noise. Horses screaming across battlefields, gods throwing lightning, heroes shouting over storm-racked seas, echoes bouncing off stone temples and theater masks. But not Hestia. She is the moment after the story ends. The fire you return to. The silence that makes the rest possible. By the time Hestia gave up her throne on Olympus, she had already shaped the rhythm of Greek life more profoundly than any other deity. She didn't need festivals, or sacrifices soaked in blood. She needed time, quiet time. Space for families to exist, for prayers to begin, for temples to be warmed before words were spoken. Let's return to the hearth. One last time. In every polis, a sacred flame, Hestia's flame, burned continuously. If it went out, it wasn't just a civic error, it was a kind of existential one. The community, spiritually speaking, would flicker and falter. When a colony was founded, the settlers didn't just carry tools and seeds. They carried fire from the mother city's hearth, lit in Hestia's name, carried in clay, guarded over rough seas. In this way, Hestia was not a goddess of stillness. She was the goddess who traveled without moving. She ensured continuity not by force, but by presence. And presence, as we've seen, is a strange kind of power. The Greeks understood this in their architecture, too. Most temples were rectangular, but hers, circular. No front, no back, no hierarchy, just a center. And it's worth asking, what does it mean to center something in a religion? What does it mean to place a quiet, selfless figure at the heart of ritual? It means trust. It means constancy. It means the flame is still burning, even when no one looks. In a way, Hestia wasn't just the hearth. She was home itself, not a place, but a feeling. A space where conflict ends, where food begins, where stories are told, but only after the kettle boils. Even in myths where she's absent, her absence speaks volumes. She's not at the Trojan War, not at Persephone's abduction, not among the jealous contests or furious transformations. And yet each of those stories starts somewhere. In a house, near a flame. In a city where someone still tends the fire. That's Hestia's myth. It doesn't interrupt. It underlies. And maybe that's the real lesson here. You don't always need to be the loudest to be divine. You don't need to strike or seduce or plot. You could simply hold the center, and the world, whether it realizes it or not, revolves around you. Now, let's come back to her famous moment. The day she gave up her seat. It's easy to call it humility or modesty, but maybe it was something else. Maybe it was vision. Maybe Hestia saw what the other gods couldn't. That power isn't only found in thrones, it's found in the foundations under them. In the heat that keeps people from turning to ice. In the light that turns caves into homes. And when she gave that seat to Dionysus, she wasn't stepping down. She was stepping into everything. Into every doorway, every oven, every heart that ever whispered a prayer for peace. Because, while the other gods fought to be remembered, Hestia made sure there would be a world left to remember them in. And that, perhaps, is the most sacred role of all. But here's the thought we're left with. If the fire still burns in the places we forget to look, how many other stories are still glowing in silence? Hephaestus doesn't look like the other gods. His hands are scarred, his beard ash-stained, his back is bent, his eyes narrow. Where Apollo glows, and Ares gleams, and Hermes dances, Hephaestus limps. You might not notice him at first, but tonight, we're going to follow him anyway. Because this is the story of the god of fire and forge. The only Olympian to be cast out not once, but twice. Rejected by his mother, mocked by his father, cheated on by his wife, and, still, somehow, the maker of wonders. This is the god who built the thrones they sit on, the armor they wear, the palaces they boast about, the chains that hold titans, the tools that make gods god. And yet, in the myths, he's usually in the background, always working, never shining. So tonight, we're slowing down. We're descending into his smoky, volcanic workshop. We're watching the hammer rise, fall, rise again. And we're learning what it means to build while being broken. It begins with a fall, the first one. Hephaestus, child of Hero and Hera, born without Zeus, as an act of spite or pride, depending on the version. But when Hera sees that, he's imperfect, deformed, not beautiful, she recoils. And she throws him off Olympus. Just like that, the newborn god falls for an entire day. Imagine it, the sky screaming past, the stars blurring, the wind roaring louder than thought. And then he lands in the sea. His leg breaks. His body doesn't heal right. And so he grows up not among gods, but among sea nymphs Titus and Eurynomy, who raise him in a deep grotto, where waves echo like song and the light never touches the walls. They see what Hera didn't. They see his hands. Even young Hephaestus begins to craft. First shells, then cups, then glowing things no one had seen before. Tools with minds of their own, trinkets that sing, lanterns that remember. He discovers that he doesn't need Olympus to be divine, he just needs fire. And so he finds it somehow, deep in the ocean bed, or maybe he creates it. No one's quite sure. But soon, the grotto fills with sparks, steam, molten metal. The air changes, the world tilts, and before long, Hephaestus has built something impossible. A throne for Hera, not a gift. A trap. You see, this is the first turning point in his myth. He sends the throne to Olympus not in anger, exactly, but in a kind of quiet defiance. Hera, flattered, sits, and cannot rise. Chains grow from the armrests. Clamps twist under her wrists. The throne grips her like a spider's web made of bronze. No one can free her. Not Ares, not Hermes, not even Zeus. Only Hephaestus knows the secret, and he's not answering summons. Let's stop here. This isn't a violent revenge. No fire rains down. No curses are cast. Just a mechanism precise, clever, beautiful. A god's pain turned into invention. He doesn't scream. He doesn't destroy. He designs. Eventually, Dionysus of all gods persuades Hephaestus to return. Not with force, but with wine. A slow, sloshing parade down the mountain. The limping god leaning on a satyr's shoulder, smiling drowsily, releases Hera, takes his place on Olympus, but not as a son forgiven, as a blacksmith still apart, still different, still the one who works while the others play. And yet everything changes after that, because now, the gods need him, need his tools, his architecture, his ability to turn idea into object. When Zeus wants chains strong enough to bind Prometheus, he calls When Achilles needs armor, it's Hephaestus who shapes it. When Pandora is created, the first woman, sculpted from clay, Hephaestus is the one who breathes her into form. All of this, from the god no one wanted to hold as a baby. But here's where it gets stranger. There's a second fall, and it's even quieter than the first. The second fall of Hephaestus isn't as violent. No screaming skies, no endless plummet through clouds, no newborn cast aside like a broken toy. This time, it's personal, and it starts with a marriage. Hephaestus is given a bride, not a mortal, not a muse, but the goddess of love herself. On the surface, it looks like a reward, a gift from Zeus for freeing Hera, an offering of beauty to balance the brute forge. But under the surface, it feels like irony. Aphrodite, the most radiant of all the Olympians, paired with the lame suit-street god of fire. There's no great love story here, no epic romance, just an arrangement. And soon, betrayal. Aphrodite takes a lover is god of war. Their affair is whispered behind column, hidden beneath armor. A perfect match in the eyes of Olympus, beauty and strength. But Hephaestus, here's Nida's shout. He builds a trap. This time, it's not a throne but a net. So fine, it's invisible. So strong, it can't be broken. Forged in silence, braided from impossibly thin strands of bronze. Hung just above the marriage bed. He waits, and when Aphrodite and Ares lie together, the net falls. It catches them mid-embrace. They struggle, furious, entangled, but the net holds. The more they thrash, the tighter it clings. Then Hephaestus calls the gods. One by one, the Olympians arrive. not in horror, in laughter. Apollo, Hermes, Poseidon, even Zeus crowed the chamber. They jeer, they joke. The moment becomes spectacle. Hephaestus stands in the corner, unsmiling, not triumphant, not gleeful, just done. Let's pause here. This is one of the most famous scenes in the Odyssey, but it's rarely told for what it is. The quiet breaking of a man who spent his life building things for others, and finally built something for himself only to have it mocked. Hephaestus wanted love, he got laughter, and even his revenge, precise and perfect, becomes a joke. Eventually, Poseidon bargains for Ares' release. The net is lifted, the lovers flee. Aphrodite returns to her realm, Ares retreats to Thrace, and Hephaestus, he returns to his forge, no longer just cast out physically, now emotionally removed, not thrown, but left behind. That's the second fall, and it's the one that never quite heals. After this, Hephaestus becomes quieter in the myths, less central, less involved in divine politics. He builds when asked, but rarely speaks. His volcanoes still erupt, his bellows still hiss, but he's no longer part of the conversation. He becomes what every craftsman eventually becomes, essential but invisible, and maybe that's how he prefers it, because there's power in obscurity, freedom in being overlooked. No one expects a revolution from the shadows, and no one watches closely enough to see what's truly being forged. Let's consider what he does build. Automata, golden maidens who help him walk, crafted from metal, filled with intelligence. Tripods, wheeled devices that roll themselves into the feast halls of Olympus, bearing food. Pandora, shaped from clay, beautiful, curious, bearing the jar that will forever reshape humanity. All of it his, while the gods flirt and fight. Hephaestus creates, always with hands burned and blackened, always half limping through smoke, but he never stops. And what's more, he never destroys. Even when betrayed, he just makes them. That might be his strangest trait of all. A god surrounded by fire and tools, capable of unspeakable destruction, who chooses precision over rage. Hephaestus, in many ways, is the most human of the gods. He suffers, he's underestimated, and still, he makes beauty. But here's the lingering question. Was he ever truly forgiven? Or did Olympus just learn to live with the sound of hammers below? The forge never sleeps. In the myths, Hephaestus is always working, not because anyone thanks him, not because Olympus praises his name in song, but because he can't stop. Because the fire inside him burns deeper than any heart. And because, maybe, it's the only thing that's ever fully accepted him. Let's return to that forge now, deep under Mount Etna, or perhaps buried beneath Lemnos, or the Perino once, quite sure where. The ancient Greeks didn't really want to know. It was enough that the mountain smoked, that the earth rumbled, that the wind smelled of sulfur. They said Hephaestus lived there, hammering at his anvil, sparks rising like prayers. Down here, in the flicker of molten orange, the god walks differently. There's no limp, no sneer from Ares, no sideways glance from Apollo, just tools, metal, precision, and silence. Hephaestus is surrounded by assistants of his own making automata, golden figures with mechanical minds. They serve without complaint. They glide like dancers, fluid and loyal. Some hold glowing ink, others polish shields that shine with their own stories. Here, in the dark, he isn't broken. He's whole, because Olympus never really made space for Hephaestus. They tolerated him, used him, occasionally remembered to invite him to a wedding feast. But the forge needs him, and perhaps that's why he continues to build, not just for function, but for expression. Take Achilles' shield, commissioned by Thetis, Achilles' mother, at the height of the Trojan War. She doesn't ask Zeus. She doesn't ask Athena. She goes to Hephaestus, and what he gives her is more than a weapon. It's a world. He forges a cosmos onto the bronze. Cities at peace, cities at war, farmers plowing fields, dancers spinning in rings, stars circling above. It's not a shield, it's a philosophy, a message to the gods. I see the world, too, and I can shape it. The same is true for Pandora, the first woman, sculpted from clay by Hephaestus, given breath, made to be beautiful, but also curious. The other gods gave her gifts, but he gave her form, he gave her life. What does that say about the god who was rejected at birth, who was thrown away, mocked, betrayed? It says this: even the unwanted can become creators, especially them. because they know what it means to be broken, to be on the outside, too long for recognition. And in that longing, they find ways to make things no one else imagines. In this way, Hephaestus becomes something more than a god. He becomes a reminder, a quiet lesson in endurance, in labor, in patience. The forge is a sacred space not because it glows, but because it transforms, or becomes blade. Hurt becomes beauty. That's the slow magic of not quick like Hermes, not dazzling like Apollo, just steady, endless, unseen. Let's close with a strange little fact. In some later stories, Hephaestus marries again not to Aphrodite, but to Aglaia, one of the Graces, a goddess of beauty, yes, but also splendor, brightness, not seductive like Aphrodite, just light. It's not a myth often told. It's too calm, too uneventful, too boring, but maybe that's the point. Maybe, after a lifetime of being cast out and laughed at, Hephaestus finally found peace. Not on Olympus, not in love songs, but in work, in fire, in one small moment of warmth. So the next time you see a flame flicker, or a hammer strike steel, or an invention quietly change the world, think of the god who fell twice, and rose by building things no one else could. Some myths crash open, monsters screaming, gods quarreling, ships ablaze. This one walks slowly, a centaur, old and quiet, is gathering herbs by moonlight. He's not in battle, he's not drunk, he's humming something low and wordless, with his back to the world. This is Chiron. Not the wild kind, not the rowdy centaurs you've heard about, not the ones who crash weddings or tear through villages with wine and chaos. No, Chiron is different. He reads, he heals, and he lives. For a very long time. So long, in fact, that he begins to fade into the edges of mythology. Always there, but rarely central. Always wise, but never triumphant. His story is not about conquest. It's about care. Tonight, we follow the life of a creature who trained the greatest heroes of Greece and asked for almost nothing in return. But we'll also see why immortality, when given to someone so gentle, becomes a quiet kind of burden. Let's begin at his beginning. Chiron is born of Kronos, yes. That Kronos, the Titan who swallowed his children and Philyra, a scene. But he is not born in Olympus. He is born in secrecy. Kronos, trying to hide the affair, transforms himself into a stallion Midembris, a son with the body of a horse and the heart of a man. A centaur, but not like the others. Abandoned at birth. Ashamed, Kronos disappears. Philyra begs the gods to change her into something else. They grant her wish. She becomes a linden tree, still rooted where her tears first fell. And so, Chiron is raised by none of his parents. Instead, he is fostered by Apollo and Artemis. He grows up under stars and study. He learns music from Apollo, hunting from Artemis, healing from nature itself. While other centaurs brawl, Chiron observes. He learns anatomy, astronomy, herbology. He crafts salves, charts the heavens, offers guidance. He builds a cave on Mount Pelion, and slowly, students begin to come. Not just mortals, heroes, Jason, Theseus, Achilles, Asclepius, even Hercules, for a time. Each arrives as a child or a teenager, angry, confused, lost. Each leaves with tools, not just weapons. Chiron doesn't fight their battles. He teaches them how to choose which battles are worth fighting, and then he lets them go, always watching from a distance, always returning to his cave, alone. That's the strange gift of immortality. It stretches, not like gold, but like thread. And when no one ages with you, time becomes less a blessing, and more a waiting room. Let's pause for a moment on the students. Take us under Chiron's care. He learns not just how to heal, but how to resurrect. He becomes so good at medicine that he starts cheating death. And what happens? Zeus strikes him down, because there are rules. Because some knowledge is too powerful, even for gods to trust. And Chiron, he mourns, but he doesn't protest. He doesn't rage at Olympus, or demand justice. He simply plants more herbs, tends the fire, waits for the next student. This is the rhythm of Chiron's myth, the slow, repetitive cadence of instruction, loss, and patience. But eventually, even for a mortal, something breaks. Something changes. It begins with an accident, and the man who causes it is someone Chiron once trusted like a son. The student who returns is older now, stronger, tired in a way heroes only become after they've lived too long on the edge of violence. He visits Chiron, briefly, perhaps for advice or maybe just for a moment of peace, one last visit before the next war calls. Chiron, as always, welcomes him. They share a fire, maybe some honeyed wine. They talk in half memories of younger days and bruised knuckles, of archery lessons and star charts, of mistakes turned into myths. Then it happens. A misunderstanding, a small brawl, outside Heracles' friends, loud and hot-blooded, clashing with local centaurs. Wine was involved. So was pride. Heracles reaches for his bow. An arrow flies. It's one of the special ones. The ones dipped in hydra venom, meant to kill monsters. But it doesn't strike a monster. It strikes Chiron. And for the first time in his long, quiet life, the immortal teacher is wounded. The arrow lodges deep. The venom spreads fast. Chiron stumbles, breathing smoke, not fear. The pain isn't just sharp, it's endless, and it won't kill him. That's the curse. He can't die. He is immortal, and now he is suffering. Heracles is horrified. He runs to him, tries to help, tries to remove the arrow, but it's too late. The wound is eternal, and so Chiron, godlike and gentle, finds himself in a paradox. Too divine to die, too wounded to live. The pain is not just physical, it is existential. The centuries he once wore like a robe now cling to him like chains. His cave becomes a prison. The firelight he once shared with students flickers, cold and lonely. Even the stars seem to look away. There is no myth of rage here, no vengeance, no accusation, only resignation. Chiron doesn't blame her. He understands, because that's who he is. Even now, limping, groaning, unable to sleep, he still listens when visitors come. He still offers what wisdom he can, though his voice is quieter now. And perhaps that's what makes this wound more tragic than heroic. It's not about war. It's about weariness. He endures it for a long time. Decades. Maybe. There's no record of how long the suffering lasts. Time bends around immortals. But eventually, even the gods begin to notice. Zeus, Prometheus, Heracles, they plan. And in a final act of mercy, a bargain is struck. Prometheus is still chained at this point. Remember suffering eternal punishment for giving fire to mankind. His torment is legendary. But there's a loophole. If someone willingly takes his place, Prometheus can be freed. And Chiron he doesn't hesitate. A god who has suffered long enough offers himself in place of another who has also suffered too much. And just like that, immortality becomes mortality. Chiron is unchained. From pain, from time, from the burden of watching generations pass him by. He dies not in battle, not in glory, but in exchange. A quiet trade, a surrender, and in return, he's remembered. He is given a place among the stars Centaurus, the constellation, still watching, still teaching. Let's pause there, because this is not a typical myth ending. There is no triumphant last stand, no blazing finale, just a release, a soft exhale, a reminder that wisdom is not loud, that love doesn't always mean clinging but sometimes means letting go, and that even the immortal grow tired. But here's the part that lingers. Was Chiron's pain punishment? Or fate? Did his students forget him? Or do they live differently because he once taught them how? After Chiron gave up his immortality, the world didn't shudder. There was no earthquake, no festival or hymn. He simply disappeared. And yet, his absence echoed deeper than many gods present. Because Chiron was never meant to be remembered for one heroic act. He was remembered for thousands of quiet ones. For the mornings spent grinding yerbs. For the nights spent pointing at stars. For the long, thoughtful silences between a teacher and a student. Let's walk, for a moment, through what he left behind. Jason, the leader of the Argonauts, learned restraint from Chiron. The idea that leadership wasn't about volume, but about knowing when not to speak. Achilles, often remembered for rage, spent his childhood in Chiron's cave, learning music, balance, and the art of healing before he ever touched a blade. Asclepius, god of medicine, was trained not to fight death, but to understand it. And even when his knowledge offended Olympus, it was Chiron who had first handed him the scalpel. Theseus, Heracles, Peleus, they all passed through that cave, and though their names echoed in epic poems, Chiron's name was usually tucked in the margin. But that's how he lived in the margin. Never the loudest, never the center, always the thread that held the story quietly together. Now, let's reflect on something strange. Why did the Greeks create a centaur so different from all the others? Centaurs were often portrayed as chaotic, bestial, impulsive, wild creatures torn between animal and man. But Chiron was balance. He was the reminder that knowledge isn't loud, that being half-beast doesn't mean being less, that wildness can live alongside discipline. He was born of an accident, a body neither here nor there. And yet, he became the most trustworthy figure in myth. Maybe that's why his cave became a symbol, not of power, but of preparation. Heroes came to Chiron before they went out into the world. They were shaped by him not just in strength, but in thought. And when they left, he let them go. That's rare in mythology. Most mentors seek glory through their students. Chiron asked for nothing. He simply lit the torch and returned to his herbs. We sometimes think of immortality as a gift, but Chiron's life shows the truth. To live forever is not to escape pain. It is to accumulate it. Grief, layered over centuries, watching pupil after pupil rush toward death while he remained behind, unchanged, unchanging. That's why the wound from Heracles' arrow wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It said, even immortals have limits. And when Chiron traded his undying life to free Prometheus, it wasn't an act of sacrifice. It was an act of release. Freedom from the role he'd never asked for. From the cave that had become a cage. From the long line of departures that always ended the same way. But here's the beauty in it. Chiron chose to end his story. And in doing so, he became timeless. He lives in the constellations now. Has Centaurus half man, half horse, bow raised toward the southern sky. The Greeks believed the stars were gods who had stepped away from the earth not to abandon us, but to watch from afar. And maybe, if you look long enough, you can still see Chiron, not in battle, not in pain, but resting finally, and maybe smiling, because even gods need sleep, and even teachers deserve rest. But here's what stays with you after the story ends. Who would our heroes have been without Chiron? Would Achilles have learned grace? Would Asclepius have healed? Would Heracles have even regretted the arrow? We'll never know. But one thing is certain. The world needs more Chiron, even now. You've probably heard of Pandora, the first woman in Greek mythology, the one who opened the box and unleashed all the world's misfortunes, sickness, hunger, jealousy. But here's what they often forget to mention. It wasn't a box. It was a jar. And she didn't open it out of wickedness. She opened it because she was curious. Tonight, we slow down. We walk past the blame and scandal. And we take a long, quiet look at a myth that has often been told too loudly. We meet a woman made of clay, given every divine gift, and one gentle flaw. And we ask the question no one seems to ask. What if Pandora wasn't a curse? What if she was a mirror? Let's begin, as many Greek stories do, with punishment. Prometheus has just stolen fire from the gods. He's given it to Eumanza, spark of independence, a flicker of rebellion. Zeus is furious. He doesn't strike the humans. He doesn't take the fire back. He does something slower. He commissions a gift, not for Prometheus but for the humans he helped. He sends word to Hephaestus, the smith god. Make me a woman, Zeus says, out of earth, out of clay. Shape her carefully. And Hephaestus does. He molds her with calloused hands, smooths her edges, crafts her arms, her brow, her breath. She is not like the others. She is new. Then the gods begin to layer her with gifts. Aphrodite gives her beauty. Hermes gives her speech. Athena teaches her skill with cloth. Apollo bestows music. Even Hera adds curiosity, not a wild hunger for secrets, but a gentle wondering. And when they're finished, they name her Pandora. Inside, something stirs. The myths don't say what exactly, just that it holds the seeds of all sorrow. And she is told not to open it. Not now, not ever. So she carries it with her, not as a weapon, not as a trick, just as part of her. Now, Pandora is given to Epimetheus, brother of Prometheus, a peace offering of sorts. Prometheus had warned his brother never to accept gifts from Zeus. Epimetheus, whose name literally means afterthought, doesn't listen. He welcomes Pandora, and they begin to build a life together, a home, a rhythm. And for a while, everything is quiet. The jar stays shut, but it's there on the shelf, or in the corner, or under the bed. And Pandora, she starts to wonder, what was so dangerous? What was so secret? She doesn't rush. She doesn't pry. But curiosity, you see, isn't a flaw. It's a feature. And eventually as Lalishi opens the lid, just a crack, just enough, and the world changes. The lid shifts. A faint sigh escapes. And then a rush. Not a scream, not an explosion, but a wind. Thin, sharp, almost invisible. Out of the jar spills everything the gods had hidden. Suffering, sickness, toil, aging, envy, loss, madness, hunger. They pour into the world like shadows freed from silence. Pandora stumbles back. She tries to shut it. Her hands tremble, but it's too late. The jar is open. The damage already done. For the first time, humankind feels weight. The weight of weakness, of tired limbs and anxious minds, of illness with no cure, and time with no mercy. And here's the part most forget. Pandora does not laugh. She does not dance. She does not mean to destroy. She weeps. She clutches the jar to her chest and watches a world shift around her, a world that had once been simple, golden, sun-drenched. Now, it is gray. It has edges. It hurts. Let's pause. Because the myth, up until now, is usually framed as a warning, a tale of disobedience. She shouldn't have opened the jar, they say. She brought all this on us. But what if we're reading it wrong? What if it wasn't about evil entering the world? What if it was about truth? Before Pandora, humans were said to live in a golden age. No pain, no death, no labor, but also no choice. No complexity, no growth. They were perfect, perhaps, but they were not fully alive. And maybe the jar, curious, mysterious, forbidden, wasn't a curse at all. Maybe it was a mirror. Pandora doesn't unleash horror. She unleashes life as it is unpredictable, flawed, beautiful, in its Let's return to her now. The winds have slowed. The room is still, and at the bottom of the jar, nestled among the dust and sorrow, something remains. Something glowing, something quiet, something small. Hope. The Greeks called it. And here, the myths split. Some say hope is the final trick and illusion, meant to keep us struggling through a broken world. Others say it's the only true gift in the jar, the only thing that makes the rest bearable. Pandora, breathing hard, sees it. She lifts the jar again slowly. It moves differently than the others. It floats. It doesn't cling like grief. It doesn't bite like pain. It waits, and then it settles into the corners of the human spirit, quiet, persistent, absurd. The belief that tomorrow might be better. The idea that even after all the wounds, you can still laugh again. That's hope, not certainty, not comfort, just possibility. Now, Epimetheus returns. He finds the jar open. He sees the tear tracks down Pandora's face. And he doesn't shout, because he, too, understands now. This isn't about blame. This is about being human. From that day forward, they live differently. No longer untouched by pain, but no longer shallow, either. They plant gardens with trembling hands. They hold funerals. They raise children and bury friends. And in each moment, each small, aching, ordinary act, hope flickers quietly. Let's reflect on this. Pandora wasn't made to fail. She was made to begin something. To move humanity from innocence into awareness. From stasis into motion. From perfection into story. And like Prometheus with his fire, she changed the world, not through violence, but through a single, irreversible gesture. A choice. A crack in the lid. But here's the haunting thought. Was the jar a test, or was it a gift? The jar remains in the corner of their home, empty now mostly. Except for that trace of hope that never quite fades. Not glowing anymore. Not spinning in the air like dust in sunlight. Just resting there. Curled at the bottom like an ember that refuses to go cold. Pandora never throws it away. She keeps it close. Not as a reminder of failure, but as a symbol of what came next. Because life didn't stop after the jar opened. It started. And that's the quiet irony of this myth. The first woman is remembered not as a mother, or a founder, or a creator, but as a warning. And yet, what she truly represents is beginnings. Before her, there was no hunger but no joy in eating. No aging but no urgency in loving. No death but no reason to hold anything close. After her, there is grief, but also growth. Loss, but also meaning. The Greek poet Hesiod, who first recorded the myth, calls her a Kalankakuna, beautiful evil. But maybe he misunderstood her. Maybe he saw only the shadow and not the shape. Because Pandora doesn't curse the world. She unlocks it. And if we return to the jar pythos, not box, we find something even stranger. In the ancient Greek world, jars were storage vessels. Used to keep grain, oil, wine, essential items for daily life. Ordinary thing. So what was the jar doing? Sealed and hidden in the hands of the first woman. Maybe it wasn't punishment. Maybe it was potential. Maybe Zeus, in his fury, at Prometheus, didn't want to end humanity. He wanted to change them, to move them from safety into experience. And Pandora was the passage, the bridge between innocence and complexity. She is not Eve, bearing the weight of sin. She is not Lilith, raging at the gods. She is curious. She opens. She faces what comes. She does not run, and that's something extraordinary. We don't see what happens to her after. The myths go quiet. She disappears into the backdrop of human life. But maybe that's exactly where she belongs. Because every act of creation comes with risk. Every child born into a world of pain. Every invention that can harm as much as help. Every day begun with the knowledge that sorrow might visit by nightfall. And yet we keep going. We plant seeds, knowing not all will bloom. We build families, knowing we might lose them. We love, knowing it might break us. That is the legacy of Pandora. Not destruction, but vulnerability. And from that vulnerability, a kind of strength even the gods didn't expect. Here's the final, quiet thought. They say Pandora released all the evils into the world, but also hope. But maybe it wasn't in the jar. Maybe she was hope. In the shadow of Mount Malus, far from the feasts of Olympus and the fury of war gods, there lived a king who wanted nothing more than to understand the world. His name was Midas. And no, this isn't the story you're thinking of. There's no golden touch yet, no wild wishes, no tragic lesson about greed. That comes later. This story begins before all of that, with a man who wasn't hungry for wealth, but for order, for measurement, for certainty. He catalogued the trees in his orchard, the stars above his roof, the way the bees returned at the same time each morning. He measured rainfall. He tracked winds. He named the hills. He timed his sleep. He charted the silences between bird calls. Midas wasn't known as a tyrant, nor as a hero. He was just curious, but also quietly desperate, because the world, for all its patterns, kept slipping past him. He could write the number of vines in his vineyard, but not why some grapes turned bitter in a perfect year. He could track the shadows on his walls, but not why they sometimes felt longer than they should. He built a life out of counting, and still he felt something was missing. So when the satyr appeared, drunk and slurring and tangled in vines, Midas didn't call the gods. He sat him down, poured him wine, listened. The satyr's name was old companion of Dionysus, a creature of stories, of riddles, of truths that sounded like nonsense, and nonsense that sounded like truth. Midas fed him, clothed him, let him sleep in silk, and in return, Silenus told him of lands where rivers ran backward, of kings who ruled dreams, of truths so deep they made reason feel like dust. Midas didn't understand, but he wanted to. So when Dionysus arrived to reclaim his old friend, Midas bowed low. I return him freely, he said. But may I ask one thing? Dionysus, half drunk himself, wild-eyed and generous smiled. Name it. And Midas, ever the measurer, said, let everything I touch turn to gold. And so the real myth begins. But not with riches, with a man who wanted to know something for certain, and chose the wrong certainty. Dionysus didn't ask why. He didn't warn Midas. He simply nodded, wine sloshing in his cup, and said, so be it. The satyr Silenus, still draped in his gifted robe, laughed gently, not cruelly, just knowingly. And then they left, leaving Midas alone with his wish. At first, it was astonishing. He reached out to steady himself on a grapevine end. The bark beneath his fingers turned to shimmering gold. He plucked a figget, gleamed in the sun like hammered metal. A pebble at his feet became a coin. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a dream. It was real. And for the first time in his careful, measured life, Midas felt something he couldn't record on paper. He walked his orchard, transforming every branch, every leaf. The earth cracked under his gilded boots. Birds fled his golden trees. The wind stopped singing. Still, he smiled. He touched the walls of his home. The doors, the vases, the steps, all gold, all perfect. He counted their weight, calculated their worth. He measured the precise diameter of each transformed object. He even recorded the rate at which the change happened. And yet, he felt the old hunger return, annoying in his belly. Not for wealth, but for understanding. Because the gold, while dazzling, didn't explain anything. It didn't tell him why a storm made him feel lonely. It didn't tell him why the taste of ripe peaches made him sad. It didn't explain why he still woke up each morning feeling like he'd forgotten something important. Still, he tried to celebrate. He called for his servants, but they kept their distance now and easy around their gleaming king. He sat at his golden table, his golden chair pulled close, and reached for a loaf of bread. It turned to gold in his hands. He bit it. It shattered in his mouth like a statue. He reached for wine. It glugged into his cup, thickened and froze. Mid-pour, into a golden sculpture of a stream. He touched his lip. It numbed. Midas stared. And for the first time, he panicked. He fled to the garden, tried to drink from the fountain. It crusted into metal. He pressed his palm against the soft earth. It rang like a bell beneath him. Nothing lived under his hands now. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. The world had become measurable, predictable, dead. And here was the cruel twist. Midas had always sought control. He wanted rules, constants, clean lines in a messy world. And now he had them, but no warmth, no texture, no imperfection. He returned inside, hungry, thirsty, shaking. And then his daughter entered. Some versions of the myth say he had none. Others give her a name, Zoe or Marigold. It doesn't matter. What matters is that she was alive, and she saw her father trembling in a house made of treasure and ran to him. He reached out instinctively, and she turned to gold. Her laughter froze mid-sound. Her arms hardened around his neck. Her eyes went blank, and Midas fell to his knees. The wish had worked. The touch was golden, and he had finally learned something he couldn't measure. Grief. The palace was silent now. Gold doesn't creak. Gold doesn't breathe. Gold doesn't cry. Midas sat beneath the statue that had once been his daughter, his fingers trembling, afraid to move. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place. Dust didn't settle. Shadows didn't shift. The world had been converted into a shrine of shimmering stillness. This, he thought, was certainty. Everything he touched obeyed him, and yet he had never felt less powerful. Let's pause here, not in pity, but in recognition. Midas didn't wish for gold because he was greedy. That version came later. He wished for clarity, for certainty in a world that constantly changed, for a world that followed rules. And what he learned too late is that a world without uncertainty is a world without life. He tried to sleep that night. He couldn't. The sheets turned rigid. The mattress cracked beneath his weight. Even his breath felt heavy in his lungs, metallic in his throat. At dawn, he fled the palace. No horse, no guards. Just a man in rich robes, staggering toward the forest. The same path Silenus had wandered in from. The same crooked trail. The gods still walked now and then, unseen by mortals. He shouted Dionysus' name. Once, twice, nothing. Then, slowly, the woods began to change. The trees didn't turn to gold. They rustled softly, smelled of bark, moved in rhythms Midas couldn't chart. He followed the sound of laughter, and in a clearing, surrounded by ivy and wine cups and half-asleep satyrs, stood Dionysus, cup in hand, curious. Midas fell to his knees. It worked, he said. I know, said the god. I didn't mean you meant exactly what you said. Midas nodded, silent. I want to undo it, he whispered. Dionysus raised an eyebrow, because it was lifeless. The god was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped forward, tipped his cup over, and spilled a single drop of wine into Midas' palm. Go to the river Pactolus, he said. Bathe in it, wash the touch away, and leave your golden hunger behind. Midas didn't ask what would happen next. He didn't ask if it would work. He just ran. The Pactolus was a narrow river, then cold and winding, with pebbles that tickled bare feet and reeds that hummed in the wind, and the water shimmered around him. The gold flowed from his skin like smoke, like pollen, like sorrow made visible. It drifted into the current, and legend says, to this day, the sands of the Pactolus are flecked with gold. But Midas did not take any with him. He walked home slowly, and when he arrived, the palace was no longer glowing. The walls were pale again. The statues were gone, and in the courtyard standing barefoot, blinking in the morning light was his daughter. She ran to him. He stepped back, afraid, but her arms wrapped around him, warm and soft and alive. And this time, she did not turn to gold. Later, Midas gave up the throne. He moved to the countryside, tended to vines, let the grapes rot once or twice before harvesting them. He stopped measuring the shadows. He let the birds come and go without counting them. He grew old, not like a king, but like a man, quietly, imperfectly, free. and the jar of golden coins he once kept beneath his bed. He buried it, somewhere near the river, but no map, no marker, no plan to return. Because sometimes, knowing everything is the fastest way to understand nothing at all. And sometimes, the best thing you can do is let go. But here's the question that lingers. Was the curse in the gold? Or in the part of him that believed the world would make sense if only he could control it? There are gods of war, of love, of thunder, and revenge, and poetry. And then there's Iris, the one who runs. Tonight, we follow her not through storms, but through stillness. Not during battles, but between them. Because Iris never commanded legions or claimed temples. She carried messages, that's all. And somehow, that was enough. This is the myth of the rainbow goddess, the divine courier, the one who moved quietly while the rest of Olympus shouted. Iris is rarely the center of stories. She appears, speaks, vanishes. No drama, no weapon, just a path between sky and sea, between gods and mortals, between one moment and the next. She was not worshipped with festivals. She did not demand statues, but her presence, like a streak of color in gray skies, was always felt. Let's begin with her name. Iris. In Greek, it means both rainbow and messenger, two meanings braided into one figure, both soft, both fleeting. Her parents were Dormas, a sea god, and Electra, a cloud nymph. From the very beginning, she was born between worlds of air and water, of movement and mist. Unlike Hermes, the other messenger, Iris did not serve only Olympus. She served order itself. She brought news from gods to mortals, from one Olympian to another, and from the far reaches of the world to the seat of divine judgment. Always neutral, always fast, always forgotten once she left. But that's the thing about messengers: when they do their job well, they disappear into the words they carry. Let's follow her for a moment. Through a storm, you wouldn't see her, but you might feel her when the wind changes, when the lightning pauses, when someone receives news they didn't expect. In the Iliad, she appears briefly to deliver Zeus's commands. She speaks gently, never exaggerates, never distorts. She tells the truth not because she believes it, but because it's her task. She doesn't choose sides, not even when the gods themselves go to war. And perhaps that's why the Greeks saw her as a rainbow, not just for beauty, but for balance. A line drawn in light, connecting storm and sky, vanishing before it can be grasped. But here's the question the myths never quite answer. If Iris never chose a side, did she ever belong anywhere? In a world where gods burned with emotion, jealousy, wrath, lust, pride, Iris remained steady. She didn't bicker like Hera, didn't boast like Apollo, didn't scheme like Athena. She simply moved, from sea to cloud, from command to delivery. And while others battled for favor and attention, Iris slipped between worlds unnoticed. Let's follow her again, this time across the ocean. There's a moment in the Iliad when Iris is sent not to a god, but to a mortal, Priam, king of Troy. She tells him what the gods have decided. Not cruelly, not gently, just clearly. And then she leaves. No lecture, no manipulation, just the message. Imagine being Priam, a father about to lose a son, a king with too many enemies and not enough time. And the only thing that reaches you from is a rainbow that whispers truth, then disappears. That's Iris. She doesn't comfort. She doesn't argue. She informs, and in that clarity, there's something rare in myth. Because unlike Hermes, who lies when it suits him, or Athena, who uses truth as a weapon, Iris never distorts. She carries only what she is told. And still no one builds temples in her name. Why? Because Iris wasn't about worship. She was about function. The space between, the link that doesn't claim attention, but without which nothing connects. In times of crisis, she ran, not to intervene, but to deliver. And when Zeus raised his hand or Hera furrowed her brow, it was Iris who knew before the others what the command would be. She saw the shape of things before they unfolded, but she never acted on them. Let's stop there, because that's the core of this myth, not the grandeur, but the restraint. In Greek mythology, that's almost unheard of. Gods overreach, mortals defy, heroes rebel, but Iris, she accepts her role, not out of passivity, but out of purpose. She's not voiceless, she's disciplined. She chooses not to influence, and in doing so, she holds the system together. That's what makes her different from Hermes, even though they share the same function. Hermes is playful, tricky, occasionally biased. He nudges fate. Iris preserves it. Without her, There's no structure, just noise. And yet, for all her loyalty, Iris remains peripheral, mentioned in passing, seen in glimpses, depicted in art more than story. Some say she poured water for the gods, others say she was Hera's personal envoy. A few whispers say she descended into the underworld bearing divine decrees. But always briefly, always respectfully, never to stay. There's something profoundly modern about her. Not the hero, not the villain, not even the chorus. Just essential and invisible. But here's the mystery that remains. If she heard every command, saw every betrayal, knew every twist of fate, what did she think about it all? By the time the Trojan War ended and the gods retreated to Olympus to lick their wounds and rewrite their stories, Iris had already moved on. No speeches, no exit, no reward. Just another message, another task. She never claimed credit for keeping the world stitched together. She didn't need to, because that was never the point. You might wonder what happened to her. Why the myths, so rich in chaos and glory, grew silent around her name. But perhaps that silence is her legacy. Not erasure, but completion. She did her job and left no debris behind. There are depictions of Iris, of course, in vase paintings and mosaics. Always graceful, always mid-stride, often rainbow, holding a herald's staff or a jug of water drawn from the Styx. Her eyes are focused, her body poised. She is never idle, and in that motion, there's meaning, because Iris was more than a divine messenger, between heaven and earth, between order and emotion, between knowing and acting. She existed in the in-between. Let's look more closely at the rainbow itself, her symbol. Rainbows don't last. They appear when opposites meet, light and rain, clarity and mist. They stretch across the sky, not with permanence, but with gesture. That's Iris. She doesn't stand. She connects. And then she fades. In a world obsessed with drama, she chose direction. In a pantheon built on feuds, she chose flow. We don't know if she loved, if she hurt, if she ever once refused to deliver a message she knew would cause pain. But we do know this. She never stopped running. And without her, nothing reached its destination. Even the myths that barely mention her were carried on the paths she cleared. Even the gods' loudest decrees depended on her quiet steps. So when you next see a rainbow stretched thin across a gray sky, don't think of beauty. Think of function. Think of a goddess who asked for no temple, no throne, no praise, just a task, and the freedom to move through it. Because maybe Iris didn't stay in the myths, because she was never meant to. She was the one who passed through them and made sure they reached us at all. He didn't want to fight, didn't want to sail, didn't want to be remembered in song. His name was Cinyros, a king of Cyprus, a man who ruled quietly, prayed regularly, offered gifts to the gods, and asked only one thing in return: let me live in peace. And yet, as often happens in Greek myth, peace has a short half. Cinyros appears only briefly in surviving sources, and always on the margins. But when he does, it's in stories about false promises, reluctant kingship, and most of all Destiny creeping in through the back door. Tonight, we're following him not because he did something great, but because he tried not to, and failed. It starts, as many slow tragedies do, with a war he wasn't supposed to join, the Trojan War. Greece was preparing its ships. Leaders from across the region were sending troops and supplies. Agamemnon demanded loyalty. Heroes rallied, banners unfurled. But Cyprus, an island, far enough away, quiet enough. Cinyros sent a polite message: we support your noble cause. From a distance, Agamemnon, not easily satisfied, pressed for soldiers. And so perhaps nervously said, yes, he would send 50 ships. Soon, and the promise was enough for a time. But when the day came, the ships didn't arrive. Instead, Cinyros sent one real ship, and 49 fake ones, carved from wood, hollow, painted and pushed just far enough from shore to be glimpsed at sea. They looked like ships, from a distance, and that was enough for him. He had fulfilled the letter of the law, and avoided sending his people to war. A small deception, a clever sidestep, but the gods and kings rarely appreciate cleverness when it costs them soldiers. Let's pause here. What was Cinyros really trying to do? He wasn't rebelling. He wasn't resisting fate with a sword. He was doing what many of us do, trying to keep his head down, trying to fulfill obligations just enough to be left alone. And like most people who do this, he underestimated. The painted ships drifted just long enough to be seen. The deception worked for a little while. From the hills of the mainland, Commanders squinted at the horizon, counted sails, and nodded. Cyprus had answered the call, or so it seemed. But the sea has no loyalty, and the gods, least of all. The wooden ships eventually cracked. Some capsized, others rotted. A few washed ashore, and when the truth surfaced, so did the anger. Agamemnon learned he'd been deceived. The gods, always alert for insult, took it personally, because Cinyros hadn't just broken a political pact. He had broken the sacred code of promise. In the world of myth, a king's word wasn't just load, was a kind of spell. To speak was to bind. And Cinyros, in crafting false ships, had also crafted his own downfall. The stories split here. Some say Agamemnon cursed him. Others say Apollo struck him down for arrogance. A few, more poetically, say that Cinyros died by suicide, unable to live with the weight of shame and divine judgment. But what all versions agree on is this: he didn't escape. Not by waiting, not by deceiving, not by hiding behind painted wood and polite letters. Let's step back and examine what he represents. Cinyros isn't a villain. He's not greedy like Midas, not proud like Niobe. He's ordinary. He wants peace. He avoids confrontation. He uses his intellect to sidestep danger instead of facing it. And that's what makes him so quietly tragic. Because in Greek myth, cleverness without courage rarely ends well. It's not enough to trick the world once. The world remembers. The gods, especially. There's another layer to Cinyros' story that appears in late sources, one that complicates him further. Some say he was the father of Mira girl, cursed to fall in love with her own father. The stories are fragmented, contradictory, but the theme is clear. Something unfinished clings to his line. If true, it paints his fate not just as punishment, but as contagion, the kind of fate that passes through generation. And that's the haunting idea beneath his story. That running from one destiny may awaken another. That in trying to avoid a war, Cinyros stumbled into a curse. That the quiet man who just wanted to be left alone wasn't allowed to be. So how does a quiet myth end? There's no battlefield, no divine duel, no thunderbolt cutting across the sky. Just a man, alone, staring at the sea. Some versions say Cinyros walked into the surf and didn't return. Others say he struck himself down with his own sword more out of weariness than guilt. A few late poets, perhaps more forgiving, claim he died of grief, watching his kingdom fray as the truth of the wooden ships drifted back to shore. There are no clear heroes in his story, no transformation into birds or stars, no olive tree growing from his tomb, just silence. And that silence speaks volumes, because Cinyros doesn't fall because he's evil. He falls because he hesitated, because he tried to meet a storm with a whisper, because he thought, like many of us do, that cleverness might be enough to avoid consequence. But here's the irony. What doomed him wasn't cowardice. It was hope. The hope that war might pass him by, that fate might look the other way, that if he stayed still long enough, the gods might forget. But the gods never forget, and neither does the sea. Still, there's something hauntingly relatable about him. Not a hero, not a villain, just a man trying to buy time, and losing everything in the exchange. He doesn't get a golden ending. He doesn't even get a famous one. But perhaps that's the point. Cinyros becomes a different kind of lesson. Not about hubris, not about ambition, but about the quiet cost of inaction. Because while others marched to Troy with swords raised, he stayed behind with blueprints and full sails, telling himself it might be enough. And it wasn't. So if you stand on the shores of Cyprus and listen carefully, they say you can still hear the ocean brushing against something wooden, hollow, and slowly sinking. And if you ask it why it never sailed, it won't answer. But the silence will be instructive. You've probably heard of Orpheus, the musician, the man who walked into the underworld to get his wife back. But tonight, we're not telling that story, not the turning back, not the loss. We're starting after all of that, after Eurydice is gone, after Orpheus climbs out of the earth, alone, and forgets how to live. This is the story of a man who returned to the world, but didn't return to himself. Because sometimes, in Greek myth, the dead don't stay in Hades, and sometimes, the living don't stay present. Let's begin. Orpheus walks the earth again, but he doesn't sing. His lyre hangs at his side, untouched, the same instrument that once charmed stones and rivers, that made trees lean in to listen, that quieted Cerberus at the gates of the dead. Now it stays silent. He wanders hills, sleeps under trees, avoids villages. He eats little, says let. And though his feet move, he's no longer among the living, because half of him never left Hades, the part that turned too soon. that couldn't wait, that heard her footsteps Eurydice's and doubted for just a moment. That moment became his curse. She vanished again, and he remained. Alive? Yes, but not entirely. Let's pause. Orpheus isn't like the other tragic heroes. He doesn't rage. He doesn't blame the gods. He doesn't fight fate. He accepts it, and that, somehow, makes his sorrow heavier. He becomes a kind of ghost among mortals. Not feared, not pitied, just overlooked. In most versions of the myth, he swears off women, not out of anger, but detachment. He can't bear the risk of loving again, the risk of hope. Instead, he wanders, playing nothing, saying nothing, until the world begins to forget he ever lived. But here's where the story starts to shift. Because the gods don't forget, and neither do the forces waiting in the dark. The wind begins to change. Not all at once, just enough to disturb the leaves where Orpheus lies, sleeping. Just enough to remind the world he still breathes even. Time, for him, has unraveled. He counts it only by the seasons passing through the same songless trees. And then one night very quietly he begins to hum. Not a melody, just a rhythm, a pulse. Like a heartbeat remembered after too long in silence. His fingers brush the strings, and for a moment, the world leans in. Grass leans toward the sound. A stone shifts. The moonlight grows clearer, but Orpheus flinches. He sets the lyre down. The world retreats. Because music, to him, is memory, and memory is pain. Let's pause here. Orpheus represents something rare in mythology. Not the fall, but the long, dull ache of surviving the thing you thought would end you. He is the walking embodiment of unfinished grief. And grief, unspoken, grows strange. The myths differ on what happens next. Some say the Maenads find him, the wild women of Dionysus driven by ecstasy, by frenzy, by their own refusal of restraint. They dance through the forests, hair unbound, eyes gleaming, and when they find Orpheus alone, silent, rejecting love, and wine, and life itself, they see him as an insult to their god. Dionysus, after all, is the god of letting go, of surrender, of release. He clings to order, to memory, to sorrow. So they tear him apart, limbs flung into the river, his head and lyre drifting together downstream, still singing, still humming, still remembering. But other versions are softer. They say Orpheus simply wandered into death without realizing it, that he faded so gently from life that even Thanatos, god of death, didn't notice. That one day, he lay beneath a tree, dreamt of Eurydice, and woke to find her standing nearby. No judgment, no punishment. Just a reunion, like a song finally resolved after holding a single aching note. Let's sit with that. Because Orpheus's myth isn't about failure. It's about the quiet cost of returning when your heart has already stayed behind. And here's the deepest truth of it. Sometimes, the hardest part of grief isn't losing the one you love. It's surviving them. The river carries his song, long after his body is gone. The head of Orpheus sighs, lips parted in the act of remembering, floats gently down the Hebros, his lyre tangled in the reeds beside him. The current does not rush. It listens. Even the water understands. This is not just death. It's aftermath. The land mourns him quietly. Birds follow the sound for miles, not singing, just hovering in the hush. Stones tilt ever so slightly toward the banks. Trees hold their leaves a little longer that season. Because Orpheus wasn't just a musician. He was a boundary between this world and the next, between beauty and grief, between silence and sound. Eventually, his head washes ashore on the island of Lesbos, and there, it is said, it continued to sing, softly, without breath, without body. The people built a shrine around it, not a grand temple, something simpler, a place where poets came to listen, even if they heard nothing. They said the songs came in dreams, or not at all. Or maybe they were always there, woven into the wind, etched into sleep, buried in the quiet between words. Let's reflect on that, because Orpheus, unlike so many others in Greek mythology, was not remembered for conquest. He didn't slay monsters. He didn't found cities. He didn't become a constellation. He was remembered for feeling something fully, and surviving it, until he couldn't anymore. And maybe that's why the gods were so quiet around his story. Why no lightning came. Why no judgment was passed. Because they understood. Grief is not rebellion. It's a kind of reverence. And Orpheus gave everything to love Eva and his voice, in the end. But here's the quiet twist. When the myths say he died, they never say he was punished. They say he was returned. to you. At last, in Hades, they walk side by side again. This time, he does not look back. There's no rule now, no test, no condition, just silence and music, and the long, slow fading of sorrow into something else. Not joy, not peace. And that is how our series ends, with a man who forgot he was dead until he was reminded he could feel again. With stories not about glory, but about the small, steady things that hold the world together. Rainbows, firelight, music, threads of gold, hesitations, curiosities, and the quiet people behind them, gods and mortals alike, who shaped history by simply being. Thank you for walking this long, soft path through boring Greek myths with me. Now, dim the lights one last time, close your eyes, and let the silence carry you the rest of the way.